So we're pretty much there, but you remember your other button. Okay, great. This is a fast-paced, hopefully, lecture on the Missoula Floods. And almost everybody in the room knows a certain amount about the Missoula Floods, but I have brand new stuff, even from this week. Letters and stories. So this is a story that continues, and I have been in the middle of all of these explorations of getting new material from the olden days involving the Missoula Floods. And this is a talk I gave a couple nights ago in Tacoma at a cartography conference, and previous to that in Tri-Cities. So I've had some practice with this little talk, and it summarizes what I've been doing just down the hall in my office this past winter. If you've heard me with the door open and booming and probably too loud for the upstairs, that's what I was up to. So this is a little recap of what's been going on. Go. First part of this is old hat to almost all of us. J Harlen Bretz, University of Chicago. He's the geologist 100 years ago that put this story together about catastrophic floods, and he's famous because nobody believed him, or very few people accepted his work. And it wasn't until late in his life that he was finally accepted and given the highest award possible by the GSA, the Penrose Medal, at the age of 97. Here's the story for the beginners here. We have faculty, we have staff, we have grad students, we have undergrads. We're all geology people that live in Washington. We all should know the basics of this story. People off the street, they know the story, the Missoula Flood story. These are maps by Dan Coe in stages showing the source of the water coming from Montana, glacial Lake Missoula, breaking through an ice dam in northern Idaho, streaming across eastern Washington at high speeds, concentrating at Wallula Gap, forming another temporary lake, Lake Lewis in southern Washington. The water goes through the Columbia River Gorge. It ponds again down through the Willamette Valley, and some of this Missoula water gets all the way down to Eugene in a slackwater state. And then it goes out to the coast, and the coast was different back then because sea level was low. That's the presentation of the Missoula Floods. Those maps we were just looking at were done by a guy named Dan Coe, and he is a superstar in the world of cartography. I didn't quite know how famous he was until 2 nights ago when there were people from National Geographic and the State Department and New York Times, and they all knew Dan Coe. Dan Coe lives in Tacoma. Dan Coe works in Olympia. Dan Coe makes things that you've seen in the hallways and on websites all over the place. He's an illustrator. And I, right now, am trying to bolster our connection with the Washington Geological Survey. I'm trying to cover their work more. In addition to Andrew Sadowski being here, I'm hoping that we can get more of a direct pipeline between us and them. And Dan is just one of the very many talented employees that they have at that institution. Check this out. Spladam, back and forth. I like that one better. I don't know. How do you feel? Great. All right. So there's a video profiling Dan a couple of years ago where I just kind of showed up and started filming him in his cubicle and got to meet a few other Washington Geological Survey people as well. And I could not get him to say one positive thing about himself. He's a very humble guy, but he is a very talented fellow. Back to the story. Photos from Tom Foster. We know the high water mark in Montana of glacial Lake Missoula. We know the inundation of certain places in those valleys, not just Missoula, but many other places. But if you go to the University of Montana, there's benches. Those are the shorelines cut by glacial Lake Missoula during the Ice Age. Closer to home here in Ellensburg, this is Ancient Lakes, otherwise known as Potholes Coulee. Beautiful place. Dave Matthews is right off the edge of the frame here. This is carved by Ice Age flooding, the Montana water. What I'm telling you is the conventional story of the Missoula Floods. No surprises so far, but an unconventional story is coming to prepare you. Grand Coulee, carved by the Ice Age floods. Dry Falls, lots of Missoula water going over the lip of that falls. A few years ago, we had a budget for PBS. We made this animation. We put a bunch of water coming over the cliff, and people have been impressed with this video clip that cost $10,000, I might add, so we're going to get our money's worth here. But many people were like, I think you overshot it. That's an exaggeration. That's too much water. We were conservative. This is a 400-foot high cliff with 400 feet of water coming over the top of it, and it looked like chocolate milk. So the people that made that animation, we found a firm in Portland. Everybody's in their cubicles down there. They're all dressed in black. They've got the stylish frames and everything. And we're talking about a place they don't know about, Dry Falls. But this kid, Ray, was very proud that he could come up with this animation of this water. And so we gave him drone footage from the parking lot at Dry Falls. We lifted the drone. That's a real guy in shorts. And then here's Ray then putting the water in. So we've got 4 of these clips that go very fast in the finished product, but I've gotten a lot of mileage out of them over the years. What's the conventional story? This is from Montana. This is glacial Lake Missoula water coming over Dry Falls. But that water, the beautiful part of the Missoula Flood story is that there's so many different kinds of features and places that all are part of this simple story, this unified story. So places like West Bar with giant current ripples. This is a boat. We're across the river from West Bar. This is Kittitas County. Come on, man. Kittitas County. And those places, including this, with kitchen flower loess sitting on top of basaltic bedrock, and the loess being a continuous blanket once upon a time, but the flood sweeping that material away. I'm going quickly because this is what we teach in 101, most of us, and in other courses as well. You major at Central Washington University in geology. We all know the basics of this story. And photos like this from the National Geographic, where you have an isolated island of loess, we know the significance of it. It hasn't always been an island. This used to be a continuous blanket of 50 feet of kitchen flower loess, and most of the loess is gone. What happened to it? The Missoula Floods swept it away. But if you sweep up a bunch of loess, then it's going to be redeposited if you slow the water down again. And that's exactly what happened in southern Washington. We know Lake Lewis, a freshwater lake that lasted just a few days compared to the duration of glacial Lake Missoula, which is the source of the floods. And so some of us know what these places look like. These are slockwater sediments, or rhythmites, white bluffs, in other words, down by the Tri-Cities. But we currently interpret each of these beds as a separate Missoula flood. A separate flood coming over Dry Falls and then redepositing the silt. I'm telling you the conventional story. Wine Commission gave us this footage after much arm wrestling. So going through Burlingame Canyon and flying through here, there's people up at the top there for scale. These are enormous, thick, beautiful, spookily repetitive beds. And these precious places are the key to trying to understand how many floods there were. Are we really talking about 40 different beds, meaning 40 different floods? And can we be sure that each bed is representing a separate flood? And if we can find some St. Helens set S ash in between 2 of the beds where we just were, can we be sure then that one of the floods happened before 16,300 and one happened younger? I think so. But there's more to the story, and that's what I'm leading to, the unconventional story. Here's yet another way to reconstruct where Lake Lewis used to be. Ice rafted erratics that are not in the floor of these coulees, but are up high to the side. They got rafted in on blocks of ice that were being carried in the Missoula floods, and now we can get surface exposure dates on these boulders to approximate when they were stranded there on an iceberg. This is also Kittitas County. This is Mattawa, south of Sentinel Gap. This is Pasco, right next to the freeway. How many times have you driven past Pasco on 182? Have you noticed this? I missed it dozens of times before it was pointed out to me. Lake Lewis is a part of the story. Okay, we're back to Dan Coe, and I have a red circle, and I have a red shirt. And this past winter, I came up with a device. I was talking about red time being 20,000 years ago to about 14,000 years, which is the conventional story about when these Missoula floods happened. But we're leading to a part of the story that has been often overlooked, and I chose a different color for it. So, quick time out. Some of you know that during the pandemic, I started teaching myself how to use my iPhone and broadcast on YouTube. And I did 5 of these a week for the spring of 2022. So there's 75 of these things. Spring of 2020. And I was using stuff around the house, and I was just trying to keep myself entertained, and I was entertaining other people as well, just stuck at home. But the community that was built was surprisingly large and surprisingly diverse around the world, literally. And so I took that audience and then started doing geology that I didn't know. And I started learning new geology and pushing myself, and we were then suddenly using this community as a learning community. And that's where we're headed in this talk today. So this special day for me, May 22nd of 2021, was a day that I spent with Brian Atwater. Many of you know him as a famous geologist on the Washington coast, but he agreed to meet me in the Grand Coulee. Here's Steamboat Rock, and here's the chalky white beds above Banks Lake. And I was starting to I was filming, and I'm trying to focus on filming, and I'm also trying to listen to Brian. I'm trying to keep a conversation going. And you've been with brilliant geologists before. They've got a lot to say. They've got a lot of really interesting thoughts. And I was starting to have a hard time keeping up with him. And so I said, I got to stop you for a second, Brian. I was still filming. I can't keep this timing straight. When are we carving Grand Coulee? The Missoula Floods? When are these beds coming in? Is it all happening at the same time? Where was the margin of the ice? How much water is coming out from underneath the ice? And he said, look, Nick, without patronizing me, look, the simplest way to visualize this is that the coulee, the Grand Coulee, was carved long before these chalky white beds. James, this is the best part. You can't get up during this. You cannot get up during this. I've got the whole room on the edge of their chair. Go ahead. And in real time, Atwater said the Grand Coulee was carved maybe hundreds of thousands of years, or at least tens of thousands of years, before the chalky white beds that we were standing on were deposited. And I'd never heard that before. And I'd taught the Missoula Floods for 30 years, saying that everything's happening between 20,000 years ago and 14,000 years ago. And I said, Brian, who was saying that? I've never heard that before. Why haven't I heard that before? He said, J Harlen Bretz came up with that idea. I'm like, you're kidding me. The same guy that we all appreciate as the father of whatever, catastrophic flooding, he says, yes. But those were his early years and his early papers talking about a far older Spokane Flood, which was far older than the Missoula Flood time. So I just ran with that. I started making sketches. I started to talk to the live crowd through my office computer and other things. I started making videos in the field, playing with this idea of an older, bigger Ice Age flood story. Maybe it was from Montana, maybe it wasn't. But then the red, which is the Missoula story. And so for the rest of the winter, this past winter, I tried to talk to everybody I could find, all the experts and everything else, about the potential for this being true. And I picked blue for the older, bigger story. So I didn't have to look hard before I found maps like these. And I colored them blue. And this is the Spokane story. You know what blue means now, right? We're playing with a number of 150,000 years ago. It's just a working idea. Look what Bretz has. This is Bretz. One of his first maps, he has an ice sheet over the city of Spokane. He has an ice margin south of Spokane, and he has the Channeled Scablands that we all know being carved by water coming out directly from the front of the ice sheet. And there's no talk of Montana. There's no talk of Glacial Lake, Missoula. And this was his publishable narrative all through the 1920s. So there's two controversies. One is that did you really have these biblical amounts of water happening quickly? And the other one is, where's the water coming from? If you have this ice sheet here over Spokane, which he called the Spokane ice sheet and the Spokane flood, he was imagining one big flood, then Montana is out of the picture because we're blocking the pathway from Montana. So we have two stories, a red and a blue time. So all these episodes are on, they're still on there. And they started out to be 2 hours long, and by the end of the alphabet, we did 26 of these in other words, by the end of the alphabet, the things were like 3.5-hour live streams, and I'm taking a bathroom break halfway through the episode, and it was way too long, but there was so much sourced there. So now I'm getting to the community part. So there's people on the other end when you do a live stream. And you're like, well, that's nice. You're making programs for senior citizens at home. It's nice of you to do that. Well, that's patronizing as hell, number one. But to be honest, it's way more than that now. These little homespun programs enlist people like this. They've got time. They want to contribute. And you're like, well, they're not geologists. How would they possibly contribute to you? And how would you actually build a case that would then ultimately get all the Ice Age floods experts to physically come out to these sites, which is where we're heading in this talk. That's what we're doing for the rest of today. It's the citizens, the viewers, who were, I was just riding their momentum at some point in the alphabet. So let me give you some examples. There's the red story. Here's the blue story. You with me? Red, let me go back. Red is 20,000 years ago, Missoula. Blue is 150,000 years ago, Spokane. We got it. We've seen that map? Good. We've seen that. Move on. So now when we look at these pictures from classic Missoula flood country, now are we wondering, is this blue or red? This is highly erosive scabland close to the Great Blade, just next door to the Grand Coulee. Is that blue water? And where's the blue water coming from? If it's not coming from Montana, where's it coming from? Bretz says it's coming out from the front of the ice, but is that even possible? Look at the size of these potholes. Many of you have been there with Jordan. 188. These are potholes at the base of Dry Falls. There's a Ford pickup for scale. Blue color, by the way. Even the fancy animations. Is this red water or now is this blue water? If Atwater's message of the major carving is blue time and that the red time is only relatively smaller water coming in and just decorating the floors or decorating the walls with erratics, I was really turned on by that possibility that you could tease out two very different stories separated by very different times. So I'm not afraid to look amateurish. So I got the Sharpie marking pens. I'm making all sorts of things for these episodes that we're doing over the winter. And now you can see what Bretz was starting to talk about. Bretz says, look, if you look at the topography of British Columbia, there's north-south valleys. Some of them are literally called trenches, the Rocky Mountain Trench and so on. And we all know there was a thick ice sheet sitting on top of that corrugated landscape. So why wouldn't you have a bunch of water coming down those gutters, crossing the border, and dumping directly into the scablands? That was Bretz's hypothesis. Here's Jerome Lessman, who was here a couple of times in the last 10 years. He's telling us this is the topography of BC. He's got the ice sheet put on top, and Jerome says, at least when you melt the ice sheet, where's that water going to go? Forget about generating catastrophic floods. Just getting rid of the ice, what's going to happen to that water? You really are an American geologist that says the only flooding is coming from Montana? Against the grain? Against the north-south grain of the land? Getting upset now. So there's all sorts of maps, there's all sorts of contributions so far from geologists who've been watching the programs. One last one, okay. Blue water. Or maybe red water. All right, then we fleshed it out. Started visiting certain people. Sky Cooley in Montana. Those were around last year, or 2 years ago, I guess. Remember him giving a talk here. When was that? 2 years ago? Can't remember. So interviewing, live stream, YouTube, getting everybody to weigh in on this narrative that we're now trying to work on together. And Sky says, yeah, I've got beautiful glacial till in the Mission Valley of western Montana, and I've done my own rating on some papers, and there's definitely two advances. There's a blue advance and a red advance. And Sky says, you know what, let me just whip up a map quick for the entire continent. And I went to school in Wisconsin. Some of the older people in here maybe took glacial geology in other places in North America. This is not controversial. We know that the older ice advances over the Midwest got farther south than the most recent Wisconsin advance. So why is this only a red story? Why is this only a 20,000-year story in the Pacific Northwest? It's not that outrageous. So Sky's having fun with different ways to portray this story. And we're working with the marine isotope stages that we have worldwide. That's where the number 150 comes from, by the way. That wasn't Bretz using that number. That's me just taking the closest MIS. So this story works its way into the Columbia River Gorge, and I start asking experts down there. Jim O'Connor. Jim, you've spent most of your career mapping in the Columbia River Gorge, Ice Age floods. There's nobody better than you. Do you have any blue deposits down there? I've been watching every episode. I appreciate what you're doing, Nick. No, I have nothing. Everything that I have, every date I have, every erratic, every deposit, I got nothing that's older than 20,000 years ago, essentially. Let's say 30. No, nothing that's older than 30,000 years ago. Thank you for your time, Jim. Next letter in the series. Scott Burns, you've spent your whole career down at Portland State. You've done some work in the gorge. Oh yeah, I got blue. You just got to get up high enough and off to the margin, up above the dells. I've got beautiful old soils, calcretes and other things. So we weren't building towards some sort of Disney ending. This is science, and so we were just talking to whoever we could talk to, including the most grizzled veterans of the scene, asking these questions about blue versus red. And before you know it, you get into the human history of the whole thing. So I'm continuing now with this little talk, but we're now going to the guy himself. And now here's where the citizens really come through. The viewers really come through. Again, they're not geology experts, but they know how to find stuff on the internet. They found this map. So this is one of my favorite maps ever, 1928, drafted at the American Geographical Society in New York. Bretz somehow got funding to make this beautiful map to put his Spokane ice sheet over Spokane and other places. And he dashed the ice margin, and the crucial matter of where exactly this ice margin was, blue time, 150,000 years ago, that's still under debate or under study. 1956, Bretz still has that ice sheet over Spokane. He never backs away from the Spokane ice sheet. Even at age 98, he's still got the Spokane ice sheet there. But nobody has the Spokane ice sheet on their maps today. Bretz himself grew up in the Midwest. He became a high school teacher in Seattle. And 4 years teaching high school, he, in his off time and even during class time, would take the students to look at glacial deposits in Puget Lowland. And if you happen to know the history of Seattle, there were major hills that were removed in the first decade of the 20th century to make flat ground to expand the city. And so these cuts of Pleistocene geology, Bretz was writing to Bailey Willis and other experts saying, these things aren't going to last for long. I'm documenting what I can. But these are gone for good, these exposures, as they're sluicing this till into the bay. Yeah, that's quite a shot, isn't it? The remains of Denny Hill. Bretz published a PhD on quote-unquote normal glaciation and glacial deposits around the southern margin of the Puget ice lobe. It remains the expert paper on the glacial geology of the Puget Lowland. Maps. Bretz got his dream job. He lasted at the UW 1 year. He couldn't get along with his colleagues. His main enemy was a guy that used to teach here, Ed Saunders, before he moved to the UW. So we're on the map, right? We got the dick that moved to Seattle that hated Bretz. But Bretz was giving popular lectures, free. Bretz, Geology of Puget Sound. There will be many lantern slides, no technical language, and no charge of any kind. Friday, December 19th, 1913. But I had found, through the help of the viewers, that he built a house. He was planning a full career in Seattle. And so one of the viewers emailed me this cover of this bungalow magazine, and it became clear that that's the house that Bretz built. So next episode, I went to the viewers and I said, Can anybody figure out where that house was? If that house is still standing, it'd be fun to see this. All right, that's your assignment. Somebody found a birth certificate of Bretz's first son, Rudolph, and the address of that brand new house. So then I get on Google Maps like at 4 in the morning, and I'm like screwing around, and like, there's the house. Okay, got it. Street view, yellow stick person. This isn't creepy, is it? I'm not physically going there. I'm just zooming around. We can all do it. I'm really zooming, though, like I'm really interested in this house, all sides of it. I have since literally found the house, and like, I can't knock on the door, but I'm like sitting in my white car out on the curb. And why is there a man sitting in the car for 20 minutes outside of our kitchen window? I don't know, just ignore him. Maybe he'll go away. But this is the house that Bretz built. Look at this nice touch. He's got a silhouette of Rainier, I assume it's him, that originally put that in. So it's an interesting story, kind of a sad story. Hey, James is back, everybody. All right, great. All right, well done. Yes. Tell your mom I love her. So Bretz left UW and went to the University of Chicago, where he got his PhD, but now he's working with heavy hitters. T.C. Chamberlain, Salisbury are well known in geology, and they were Bretz's mentors and co-workers. And Chamberlain himself found Glacial Lake. Chamberlain himself discovered Glacial Lake, Missoula in the 1880s. And yet Bretz is not talking about Glacial Lake, Missoula as a source. I mean, there's major weirdness with this story that maybe will never be resolved. But we're heading to some of that digging right now. So Bretz has distinct chapters thinking about Ice Age in the Pacific Northwest. He's a science teacher at the high school, Puget Sound. Then he starts taking University of Chicago grad students out here every summer, pre-World War I, in the Columbia River Gorge, without a car, without vans, without walkie-talkies. They're riding rails, literally, jumping off the train, walking for a few days, dry camps, and then eventually gets to the Channeled Scablands. So Bretz has his fingerprints all over the geology of the Columbia River Gorge, something I wasn't aware of until recently. And he makes all these observations that the lower half of the walls of the Columbia Gorge are heavily scoured, but the upper half super graceful and unsavaged. That's a flood story. But he made all these observations without understanding the implications. He worked his way east and into this flood story, is the point, by starting to get very curious summer after summer, August, by the way, in the Pacific Northwest with the students. And the viewers are finding our newspaper articles, interviews with him, interviews with his students. All this detail comes to life from this time. And this is the same decade that they're building the old Columbia River Highway, and Bretz is involved to the point where Bretz is writing the first roadside geology book ever. And it was a bestseller immediately, where you can buy this newfangled thing called an automobile and drive on your own into this Columbia Gorge and teach yourself some geology. He was way ahead of his time in many ways. Okay, now the story about his journals. So the viewers were super helpful. And out loud, I was wondering to myself and the live crowd last summer, I wonder if I don't think I'm that into it. Like, if I really was into this, I would drive to Chicago, because I know there's an archives of all of Bretz's papers and journals and everything else. And that was the end of my little thinking to myself. Ryan, a viewer from Springfield, Illinois, took a day off of work, drove up to Chicago, brought his iPhone, snapped a bunch of photos, got permission, and up until that point, just maybe less than 10 geologists or journalists have been to look at those notes, and with the white gloves and everything. But Ryan must have talked his way in and said, "Can I use my iPhone? It's no big deal." "Sure, go ahead." And he sends me all that stuff, and I'm getting all sorts of stuff, and I'm starting to post these things on my website, because I want to build these programs around these original journals of J Harlen Bretz. So we're leading up to November of last year, and everything's going great, and I'm getting more and more reports from people making the pilgrimage to Chicago. And then I get an email from the University of Chicago Library. And it was not exactly a warm email. They're like, I don't know who you are out there in Hillbilly State, but this doesn't sound good to me. These notes are copywritten, and you have no right to take these journals that are 100 years old and put them on your website. I tried to explain what I was doing, and I was trying to have rejuvenate interest in the Missoula floods. They weren't having it. And so they finally said, look, the only way we're going to keep talking to you about this is if you can get permission from the family somehow. So the next day on the live stream, I said, hey, you guys find a descendant of J Harlen Bretz? Blah, 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 emails coming in. So within 3 hours, I'm talking on the phone to Joshua Bretz in Boston, who's the great-grandson of J Harlen Bretz. He's like, of course, yes, I'll send them whatever permission you need. So all of these journals, by day, are now publicly available and have been since last winter. That gets us to Thomas Large, a high school teacher at Lewis and Clark High School in Spokane. He, as the story goes, was a key person to invite Bretz out to Spokane to get him interested in the Channeled Scablands, and Thomas Large, the Lewis and Clark High School teacher in Spokane, also invited Joseph Pardee, another big name, to do this work. So I was curious about Large and what role he played in this story. And that got me to some of the descendants of Thomas Large and getting family emails and family photos from the Large collection. And photos where Thomas Large, the high school teacher, is loaning his car to Bretz to use with his students. And they busted up the car, and then Bretz had to offer to buy him a new car. It's all there on all these old letters that were in the Bretz files. So Bretz had this split life. Every summer he was out here in the eastern Washington in the 1920s. Every school year he's back at the University of Chicago teaching. These letters are personal, meaningful, and the letters alone are incredibly fun to read if you like that sort of thing. But at Christmas time, I was taking a break and got a few emails talking about, Thomas Large, the high school teacher, has all of his papers on the campus of the University of Oregon in Eugene. So I quick made a live thing. I came into school. The house is full of family, but I just need to get out of there for a little while. And I said, hey, it's December 20th. I don't know if anybody lives within an hour's drive of Eugene, but it's probably pretty good parking this time of the year. Everybody's gone for break. Is anybody willing to go into the University of Oregon to the special collections place and see if you can find a few of Thomas Large's papers? And so 7 different people who didn't know each other all showed up on the same day, 2 days after Christmas, shook hands, split the tasks, all got their iPhones going. They sent me an incredible amount by email, 50 hours total with these viewers working together to collect this stuff. So after the series was over, I was doing programs interviewing these folks who did all this work to hear them tell about this experience and how fun it was and how meaningful it was for them. These are viewers contributing to science, and you'll see the payoff from this before we quit. So Large becomes a bigger figure because of this work by the folks that went to Eugene. Personal letters from Bretz to Large. I'd love to read them all to you, but I want to keep it moving. We're going to do a few questions here at the end if you're still interested. More fun than I've ever had before. In haste, Bretz, November 1927. So we take notes for a reason, young people. And if you're doing important work, all those notes remain. Maybe your notebooks from 210 will be read by somebody some point. This fucking sucks. Spokane is the critical area to try to continue to work on this story, in part because it was home base for Bretz for much of the 1920s. And now we're back to the blue, bigger, older time, and red, younger, smaller time. It's always an inset story. We're back to those maps. We're back to Bretz's original journals. He's taking grocery bags, cutting them with his scissors, and then meticulously organizing the cover. Now we get to the point where people are reading these so Bretz typed these up, maybe at the end of every field season, or maybe decades later, unclear. But Bretz himself underlined at all these place names. And if you're a person like I am, I want to know where this guy was every day of every year. I want to be able to see those moments of discovery. And I'm not alone. You're like that perhaps. And Joel, a viewer from Sacramento, was like that. So Joel had a young family, and he said, I got, like 45 minutes free every night after I put the kids to bed, but I wanted to make this map. This is just for 1922, Bretz's first field season. But Joel made this map. These are the numbers are each day of the field season of 1922, August essentially of 1922. Bretz is riding the rail, dashed red. Bretz is walking with his 3 grad students. Walking Upper Grand Coulee, walking Mansfield, walking Carl Lilquist Country, walking. But typing everything out eventually, noting everything, working on this idea of a Missoula flood, a catastrophic flood, a Spokane flood. Well, that gets us to this character, who is also a viewer from the Spokane area, but he became one of the biggest characters in the whole series. Because Google Earth by Glenn, as I started calling him, had time and expertise in using Google Earth. He was involved in the early days of Google Earth, and he also worked for the State Department or something that he couldn't tell me anything about. So Glenn started taking every day's notes with location and plotting it on Google Earth and making a green thumbtack for every place that Bretz visited. And so there's an incredible amount of work by one guy in Liberty Lake, Washington, and these are all available on my website this afternoon if you want to go check it out. You click on a green dot, you read all the notes of that day at that stop from Bretz. So I interviewed Glenn as well. I asked Glenn to just total things up. Glenn says, I worked with more than 1,000 pages of Bretz's journals. I put more than 1,500 green thumbtacks on Google Earth. And Bretz himself spent more than 300 field days in the Channeled Scablands of eastern Washington. Now, I'm willing to listen to somebody like that. Our experts today are prolific, but they don't come close to more than 300 field days in their whole career out there. So we're back to that map, but it suddenly has more meaning. We're now personally invested with this guy, and we know his day-to-day, week-to-week, year-to-year journey through this whole thing. Using this. So he's mapping, forget the geology, he's mapping these channels with this vintage of barometer. One of the viewers gifted me one exactly like this. It's on my office shelf if you want to see one. Look at this. This is today imagery, satellite imagery, Google Maps, Google Earth. There's Bretz's map, done by hand and on foot. It's perfect. That alone would make this guy really impressive. Forget the geology. I got to say, the cartographers 2 nights ago were much more impressed than you are right now. All right. So Bretz was involved in the development of Dry Falls State Park. Yes, it happened a long time ago. Yes, the cars looked different back then. Yes, this is what Palouse Falls Canyon looked like back then. Bretz. Final part of the story. Bretz spent the summer of 26 up in British Columbia. He needed to find the source of the water. And his idea was there were volcanic eruptions underneath the Canadian ice sheet to generate the water necessary to then have outburst flooding. And he spent a full summer up there, and he got very excited in his notebooks, and one of his students opened his mouth and started giving away all the secrets of what they were doing to some newspaper in Ohio. But Bretz is not prone to underlining in real time. He's not prone to exclamation points, but he is that summer. He's like, this is an incredible time. I found this basalt flow. I think it might be young enough to be tied to when the ice was here. I see some tuyas. I see some other features that are forming when you have eruptions underneath ice. And he was going great guns with that story. And remember now, he's got these maps of the Scablands, and they just stop. They don't connect to Montana. They just stop. And he's mentally putting the Spokane ice sheet right at the heads of each of those channels and having these subglacial floods dump right into these individual channels. So in December of 26, when the GSA meeting was held at the University of Wisconsin, in the old auditorium where I took English 101, 50 years later, by the way, Bretz gave this presentation on the cause of the Spokane flood. The field has not yet been sufficiently studied to justify a definitive affirmative. This is a report in progress. So it seems like he was about to head back the next summer and continue in Canada. But then the most famous thing in the whole Bretz story happened just 2 weeks later. Do you know this part of the story? Bretz was asked to come to Washington, D.C. And there was a room in this building, which many of the viewers found where the building is, blah, blah, blah. And this thing called the Cosmo Club, which still exists today. It's like basically a high society drinking club. That's a direct quote from one of the club members that I met 2 nights ago in Tacoma, by the way. The USGS experts in Pleistocene geology all gathered together in Washington, D.C., and they summoned Bretz into the room. And Bretz had a 90-minute monologue with slides about the Spokane flood and all these details in eastern Washington. And nobody in that room, except for Joseph Pardee, had ever been to eastern Washington. And after Bretz sat down, one by one, each of the experts stood up and said, "This is impossible. This is geology. You can't do all this crazy amounts of erosion in just a few days," or whatever the hell you're saying. So he was shut down by the authority, by the experts, and he suffered a severe depression for all of spring of 1927. And when he finally recovered, I guess, he just was pissed. And he went back to every one of those field sites for the past 5 years and rechecked his measurements. And his notebook totally changes. Now he's talking directly to his critics. He's not just making notes. He's like, "This is going to do it. It's the same thing that I said in 1922. Here it is. I did the same measurement again." It's like angry. And he never went back to eastern Canada. He never went back to eastern British Columbia. So that remains a question mark in this whole story. What would he have continued to do north of the border? Interestingly, he also shifted his attention to glacial Lake Missoula after the ambush meeting, as it's called. Now, is that a coincidence, or was that a calculated move for him to say, "I'm up against a major problem here. I need to find some story that's going to have a little bit more traction"? And my mentor, Chamberlain, knows about glacial Lake Missoula, and so does Pardee, who was in the room. So possibly it was just a calculated move instead of driven totally by science. But regardless, Bretz, in the summer of 29, his last full field season out here in Pacific Northwest, he did go to the floor of glacial Lake Missoula and build a case for the Missoula floods, the red floods, the Wisconsin floods, as he had all along. I want to read this letter. You're young. You're not into old letters, maybe. You're not into letters, maybe. Did your grandma send you letters? Have you ever received a letter through the mail? I want to read this letter to you. This is between Aaron Waters in his retirement years and Bretz just a couple of years before his death. "Dear J Harlen, thank you very much for sending me a copy of that fine book by Vic Baker and others on the Scablands. It is nice to see that they give credit where credit is due to the man who walked the weary hundreds of miles and made the countless accurate observations that put the whole thing together. Today with the 1978, today with the stunning satellite pictures, abundance of paved roads, and outstanding cuts made by dam builders, irrigation engineers, and road builders, the documentation they have given was easy to get. Not so when you engaged in the hard physical labor that made your documentation possible. To me, as a country kid who grew up on the Waterville Plateau, it is a delight to see that this later work, supported by the floods of NASA and NSF dollars, and supplemented by photographs, maps, and ease of travel, has done little to document, but a great deal to confirm your hypothesis. You offered all of that, equipped with little more than a pair of sturdy legs, and a particularly agile and observing mind. Dollars and what they buy are never equivalent to what a brilliant mind and determination will do. Yours is the glory, and I salute you. Best wishes, Aaron Waters. So the end of the Bretz story is he is finally accepted. Geologists do come out all in droves. Geomorphologists in the 1960s, they see these features in the flesh. They agree this guy's right. They send him a telegram. They agree, you were right, everybody was wrong, and they give him the Penrose Medal. In this photo, Bretz is mentoring a young geologist who was the advisor of Lisa Ely here in the room here in our department. And now Vic Baker's an old guy, and Richard Waite is an old guy, and so there's some torch passing to younger people. Joel Gombiner, some of you remember, who was here last year and now works for the Washington Geological Survey with Dan Coe. And if you've been here a couple of years, you remember all these guys coming and giving talks. I was working on these narratives back then. That continues. Last fall, Brian Atwater, I think about this weekend last year, if I remember, up looking at Bretz's work, Moses Cooley, playing with the idea of subglacial floods, playing with the idea of blue water. So we're pushing even the leading scientists now to be thinking about these old ideas. They're not my ideas. They're not our ideas. They're the original work of Bretz. This is where I normally finish the lecture, but I have brand new stuff from this week. So let me do it. Yes, all these papers and all these newspaper articles and all the Google Earth files, they're all here. If you go to nickzentner.com, and Bretz and floods are no longer in the upper right-hand corner because I'm starting a new project, but those two words are up here somewhere.